had interaction with agency personnel who personally are convinced they know of. Here's a funny story. One of my colleagues, John Pickering, up in the Olympic Peninsula, very good outdoorsman. You know, his hobby was to hike the mountains and find these abandoned mines and find the old mining equipment. He was real hound about that, and very intrepid in going out into remote areas. And it was great about placing these cameras. I provided him with a back before the real high-end cameras that we have today. They're so expensive. I provided him with quite a number of cameras, and he would set out a string of cameras. Well, he placed one literally 2 feet over the boundary into the national park, the Olympic National Park, from the forest. We'd gotten a nod, an implicit nod of approval from the National Forest personnel to use these cameras, as long as we didn't use baits with them. We could use scents and odors, but not fresh fruits or vegetables or meat. They didn't want us nailing ribs on the tree trunk. I got a telephone call from a district ranger or park ranger in the national park. Actually, I got it through the university. My cameras all had property tags on them and little signs that said, property of Idaho State University. This camera's being used in a wildlife survey study. Please don't tamper with it. And telephone number. And so I got a call, and they said, we don't have any research protocol for anybody from ISU. What is it you're doing? They were afraid that it was a poacher when they first found it, because John, to his credit, had put it on a very well-traveled game trail that was used by the huge elk herd. They've got these huge rows of elk, and they had trouble sometimes with poachers who stake out a trophy stag with the game cams and then go in and harvest it. So I was very open with him, and I put right on the table what we were doing. And once it was clear to him that I was intent and sincere and genuine, he goes, well, I've seen one. I said, oh, really? He says, yeah. I said, about 5 years ago, I was hiking the perimeter, as this ranger was that had found the camera. And he said, I stopped, and I nestled in under a big cedar in the shade to eat my lunch. And he said 5 minutes went by, and all of a sudden there was this crashing in the undergrowth. He thought, oh, this is a big elk. And so he was all poised there to get a real nice view of this big elk bursting out. Never quite came out, but it came into an open spot, and you could see these two, he said, tree trunk-sized legs, hairy legs, walking down the mountainside. He said, I watched it for like 20 seconds as it went on by. And he said, I could name 4 or 5 other people in our office who've had sightings or found footprints. He said just a couple months ago, our truck driver, who's a native from the, I should like on the tribe there, but they'll pop back in. But anyway, Native American, he had one run across the road just 10 feet in front of the car in the evening and through the headlights. And I said, so what's the national park's official position on the existence of Sasquatch? Oh, they don't exist. And I said, he said, there are lots of us who know differently, but it's just an unspoken rule that we don't talk about. John Meinzinski has established quite a network with park personnel in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In fact, he and I went around, and I've given presentations at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Department in Lander and at the U.S. Forest Service office, and we visited every district office of the State Game and Fish Department, had very positive and productive discussions with the personnel there. Lots of reports from the park, from the rangers. Well, he had a meeting one day with the Director of Public Relations. As John so tactfully and adroitly does, he turned the conversation to Sasquatch. She said, oh, that's really interesting. We don't ever have anything like that happen here in the park. And he said, well, actually you do. He said, but your rangers don't feel confident in reporting it up the chain of command for fear of retribution.
Do you think that's because financially they
That-
have to set aside so much land to...
That's part of it, I think. In Idaho, for example, they denied there were wolves for years and years and years. Every time there was every time there was a sighting, no, it was a coyote. And then they had the reintroduction program, and it was challenged in federal court, and the judge said, no, you didn't do this correctly, you violated these. You have to extract the reintroduced wolves, trap them and take them out. And they go, well, it's going to be kind of hard to tell the difference between the native wolves and the reintroduced wolves. So the point was, if they weren't there, you didn't have to have people devoted to the management. You didn't have to have a management plan. You didn't have to spend the money doing it, and they were strapped for budgets. And so that could be one of the motivations. That you're right too. In some fear, it would be the mother of all spotted owls,
Yes.
and it would result in vast tracts of land being set aside and further depression of the logging industry. And so that's one fear. The other is, I think, just the practical thing is they don't want to be bothered with it. They don't want people coming. When John Meinzinski, my colleague, who was for about 28 years worked for the Wyoming Game and Fish, and then he became a private consultant, contracted wildlife consultant on various projects. When he first got involved, there was a flap of sightings and incidents, and the district supervisor called in Meinzinski and one of his other co-workers and said, look, if there's a guy out there in the first, people were showing up with high-powered rifles and saying, where's the Bigfoot? Going into the Fish and Game offices, where's the Bigfoot? He said, if there's a guy running around in a fursuit, I don't want him to get shot on my watch. On the other hand, if there really is an 8-foot tall gorilla out there that poses a potential threat to the people under my jurisdiction, I want to know about it. He says, go out and see what you can find. And that's when John started collecting. They collected several examples of footprints. They had hair that could be identified by the FBI or by the state veterinarian. They had lots of eyewitness reports. They were talking to the sheep herders, the Bass sheep herders, who described the gray man. It was this big Sasquatch that had grizzled hair, so they called him the old gray man. And they said, yeah, every time he comes around, my horses go running off. So he must be around here close because my horse, I had to go find my horse yesterday. And he said, and the sheep come up close to the trailer. And anyway, they had collected all this information, and then the supervisor got transferred, and another one came in. His first order of business is he called them into his office and said, I've heard what you guys have been doing. And he was talking to the vet and to John and this other fellow who made the three that were actually involved in it. He said, if I hear one word from any of you discussing this privately or publicly, he said, you're out, you're fired. Because, there was nothing nefarious except he felt it was an embarrassment. And he was concerned too about, quote, how taxpayers' dollars are being spent. It's just like if any of you have seen some of the responses to some of my Facebook postings or whatnot. So this is how our tax dollars are being spent. Here this professor is being paid, not that I'm being paid by federal taxes, and this is just a small part of what I do on a daily basis.
Is stigma being reduced in your, of all the years you've been in research? Are people more likely to come out? Or are they still very hesitant to be?
There still is a lot of hesitancy. I do feel a thawing of attitude somewhat, and part of the reason, well, for me personally, it's just the result of my doggedness and sticking to it, and attempting to maintain very high standards and critical approach to the subject, critical and objective approach to the subject. It's gone, in my personal experience, locally, it's gone from open criticism to silence. If we ignore it, maybe it'll go away, type of attitude. But in the scientific community generally, I am starting to feel some traction. And that began in part with the discovery announcement of Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, a little person. Because you see here suddenly, these paleontologists that are describing these only 13,000-year-old fossil skeletal remains of this little creature. They're kind of ho-humming and saying, well, yeah, and, by the way, the local people have been talking about little hair-covered people up in the mountains for generations. And in fact, there are records of early European colonists seeing them. So now maybe they're acknowledging maybe there's something to that folklore, that maybe the Floridiensis has persisted into historic times, if not recent times. So suddenly the door was cracked open a little bit further, and so what I've been, the drumbeat that I've been pounding is, look, there are new discoveries of hominids on an annual basis. The family tree is getting bushier and bushier and bushier. And at any given time, there were multiple species of hominids coexisting across the landscape. That was the rule rather than the exception. Plus, many of these lineages are now being demonstrated to have existed into the more recent past than ever acknowledged before. So we've got Homo floresiensis, 13,000 years old, being the youngest fossils that have been found. We have a new site of Neanderthal that has yet to be published, but was described informally at the meetings that preliminary dates suggest is only 10,000 years. That's a third younger than any previous site. 10,000 years. We've got a specimen, still controversial a little bit on the date, but a specimen of Homo heidelbergensis, very robust, looks like a Neanderthal, but bigger, that immediately preceded us. A specimen found just outside of Beijing that's only 12,000 years old. 12,000. So, and modern humans were in that region as early as 75,000 years ago. So, you've got, just go back 20,000 years and step out of your time machine, and you might encounter any of a half a dozen different hominids living side by side. Nova, is it Nova? Nova, I think, did a documentary series called Becoming Human. And they emphasized this, this contemporaneity of multiple species through our evolutionary past. But then when they came to the final episode on us, the title was The Last Hominid Standing. And they opened up with this discussion, why is it that we're now the only hominid inheriting the earth? What happened? Well, they attribute it to our intelligence, to our culture, to our growing population. Well, it's interesting because if you go back 40 years, there was a paradigm in anthropology called the single species hypothesis. This was taking an ecological principle, Gauss's principle, what's called competitive exclusion, that only one species can occupy a niche at any time, because otherwise they will compete. And one will be better at it than the other, and will win out. The other will go to extinction or have to shift its characteristics. Well, that was borrowed from biology and applied in anthropology to the hominid niche, and it was thought that the hominid niche of upright, manipulative, intelligent, bipedal adaptation was so unique there could be only one hominid. And so human evolution was seen as this kind of linear succession of species, one evolving into the next, one succeeding the previous. But then there were multiple, there was a lot of discussion about robust and gracile Australopithecines, some of the earliest hominids prior to tool use and increased brain size. They were just, it was argued, they're just bipedal chimpanzees. So sure, we could accommodate multiple species there. But then when you get to Homo, especially Homo erectus, there's so many changes. Fire use, decreased sexual dimorphism, very consistent elaborate toolkit, or sophisticated, not elaborate, but sophisticated, big eyes, hand axes and things, and so on and so on. All these things, big game hunting, there was a leap in intelligence, in culture, in population expansion, and they could be the only one. Well, no sooner had this been published than it was discovered that robust Australopithecines had persisted right on up alongside Homo. In fact, some of the very early species of Homo persisted alongside Homo erectus. And so even then there were multiple species. So the argument got dumped. Well, it wasn't good dumped, it just got shoved up to apply and applied to us. Well, my prediction is that it's going to have to be dumped and that we aren't the exception, but rather the rule applies and that we do share the planet with several other hominids. Almas may represent a relic Neanderthal population, or maybe Denisova. The orangutan is the hobbit. Sasquatch is a giant form of robust australopithecine or Gigantopithecus. You know, not a hominid, but a hominoid that persisted, and that we do show the plant exhalation. Now, the fact that this is starting to gain traction was evidenced in a recent issue of New Scientist magazine. It's a popular science journal. And their cover story a few months back was the 10 biggest questions in human evolution today. And question number 9 was, are there other hominins alive today? So when they interviewed me, we talked about the relic hominoid inquiry, we talked about this argument of the possibility that we're not alone. And so I was really gratified that ranked in the top 10 questions by these, at least in the estimation of these editors. So that was huge. That was a huge, admission on the part of the academic community. And although there are a few people willing to adopt a very visible, active interest in the subject publicly, behind the scenes, I have lots of them. You know, my journal has an editorial board that has a dozen PhDs, quite a number of academics in anthropology and primatology and conservation. George Schaller, who wrote the foreword to my book, is an honorary member of our editorial board. Likewise, the Falcon Project, we constituted a scientific advisory board, so there'd be some independence of objectivity in evaluating the evidence produced by the Falcon Project. And I was able to recruit a very famous tracker, Jim Halfpenny, who was up in Gardner, Montana, a prolific author on tracking guides and teaches classes all across the country. He leads eco-tours all over, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. In fact, he called me up and invited me. He said, we should do something about this. He said, let's do a workshop, a weekend workshop. And you may have seen it if you frequent my Facebook page. The forensic analysis of tracks of rare and unusual species, from Bigfoot to cougars, bobcats, and grizzlies. And so it's going to be a 3-day workshop, and one day will be devoted to the interpretation of footprint evidence for Sasquatch. And he's skeptical, but he's very curious about it. The footprint evidence compels him. His problem is, given some of the studies that have been done, the wildlife surveys, like 4 rare creatures like fishers and martins, why hasn't a Sasquatch shown up on one of those game cams? But we've seen, I tried to explain to him some of the things that may point to the Sasquatch being unlikely to fall prey to a camera trap. And but he can't just brush this stuff aside. And there are numerous examples from my collection. He's got the world's biggest collection of footprint casts of wildlife footprint from all over the world.
What's his name again?
Jim Halfpenny. Jim Halfpenny. And featured in his collection are some very interesting examples from mine.
Do these show any terminal ridges?
These examples that I brought don't. Well, the original of the Hereford track had some slight indications, given the very muddy conditions. Jimmy Chilcutt, Officer Chilcutt, noted a couple of patches that looked like they might be very, very faint germinal ridges, but no, none of these do. You have to have very fine particulate substrate in order to transfer that fine detail, and then it has to either, like dry and freeze it up. If it stays moist, gravity will pull out those details very quickly and flatten them out. So, very transient.
I got one question.
I'm sorry. Did you want to take a break for a bit, Nelson?
That'd be fine.
15 minutes?
Sure.
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 Don't want to take a break.